Benjamin Franklin is credited with saying, "Nothing is certain but death and taxes." Given the state of our taxation, I heard somebody say this week that he would probably have chosen the former. That's especially true at this time of year, as many of us are trying to figure out whether we paid enough, and some of us are wondering whether we ought to be paying at all. It seems there are always those who advocate tax resistance, from the peace movement groups that don't pay taxes because they're used to fund wars, to Tea Party conservatives who object to the use of tax dollars for excessive spending. With the implementation of Obamacare, some are wondering whether they can participate in a system that uses their payments to fund abortion. And these are important questions. In Jesus' day, the issue of tax resistance was also important. Israel had been occupied by various foreign powers since the Babylonian exile, and these foreign empires inevitably imposed taxation of many kinds. The most recent oppressors were the Romans, who had ruled the region since 63 BC. They demanded both taxes and allegiance, and after the rise of the Caesars, they also began to promote the worship of the emperor as a god. Prior to this time, Roman coins had not had the images of men on them, but beginning with Julius Caesar, the Roman denarius always carried the image of the ruling emperor. In Jesus' day, this would have been Tiberius Caesar, who ruled from AD 15 to AD 37. But the addition of that image led to an increase in tax resistance in Judea, and the poll tax, a census tax on each person in the country, was the focus. In AD 6, Judas of Galilee led a failed revolt against the Roman procurator because he took a census for poll tax purposes. Zealots, of whom Jesus' disciple Simon was almost certainly one, claimed the poll tax was a God-dishonoring badge of slavery to the pagans. In this environment, one's position on paying taxes was an important signifier of one's political leanings. The Sadducees and the family of Herod taught that submission to these taxes was right, even biblically. The Pharisees opposed the tax, though they probably paid it, because of the seeming reverence for an idol implied by Caesar's image. And the Zealots violently opposed paying the tax as one part of their resistance against Rome. So it's not really a surprise that Jesus eventually gets publicly asked the tax resistance question. It's an attempt to get him to position himself politically, endearing himself to one party, but alienating himself from the others. But Jesus, we'll see, doesn't fall into the trap. He brilliantly answers the question in a way that is still a wonderful challenge to us today. Give the state its earthly due, but give yourself to God. Give the state its earthly due, but give yourself to God. The text is Matthew 22, 15 to 22, and the opening gambit, the attempt to trap Jesus, is found in verses 15 to 17. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Last week we studied two parables that Jesus gave in response to the opposition of the Jewish leaders, warning them that they were headed down a path that would bring them to judgment. They paid no heed to these warnings. In the first 14 verses of this chapter, Jesus tells another parable about a wedding feast where he warns them that if they do not respond to his invitation, they will be cast out, and others, the common people, maybe even the Gentiles, will be brought to the feast of the Messianic kingdom. It's in response to these warnings that the Pharisees and the other leaders of the Jewish nation go out and plot again how they can entangle, how they can ensnare Jesus in his words. And the trap they chose was this question of tax evasion, for they were sure that his answer would alienate him from at least part of his following, or possibly leave him open to a charge of treason against Rome. Both Matthew and Mark tell us that it was the Pharisees and the Herodians who approached Jesus. Now, these two groups were normally at odds with each other, but as the saying goes, a common enemy makes strange bedfellows. Here the common enemy is Jesus. And the alliance between the Pharisees and the Herodians in questioning Jesus about taxes turns out to be a natural one. Unlike most of the Jews, the Herodians openly supported the reigning family of Herod and its pro-Roman allegiance. Clearly, both the Pharisees and the Herodians are more than mere envoys to this question. They are active participants, each seeking to put Jesus between a rock and a hard place. In verse 16, they use flattery to pressure Jesus to speak. Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. And if he doesn't reply after such flattery, then obviously he's not the man they pictured. He doesn't have the integrity. He is swayed by men. But notice this. The Pharisees and the Herodians spoke better than they knew, better than they intended. They told the clear truth about Jesus without themselves believing it for a moment. Jesus is true. Jesus does teach the way of God truthfully. Jesus is not swayed by appearances and externals. He looks on the heart. John says of Jesus, but Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people, and he needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. Man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. Jesus knew the hard issues that lay behind this question. He knew the trap they were setting, and he would teach the way of God to them and to us, as they said, truthfully. So having tried to flatter him with lies that turned out to be the plain truth, they finally get to the question, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Recognize that this is not, as it would be to us, a legal question. It's theological, as all such questions inevitably were to a first century Jew. Not what is right in terms of the laws of the nation or the state, but in terms of the law of God. And the wording of the question, whether it's deft or not, demands a yes or no answer. So this is, at its first appearance, just one more attempt to trap Jesus. But unlike some of the attempts we've seen, this is a question that has a bearing on every person in Judea and the Roman world of the New Testament. And it is one that impacts every believer under every government since then. So how will Jesus answer? Verses 18 to 22. But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. Jesus is aware of the malice behind the question, and he will not allow himself to be trapped. He chooses his answer on his own terms, not theirs. So first he asks for the coin used to pay the tax. That he has to ask may reflect his own poverty, or the fact that he and his disciples had a common purse, or perhaps his own reluctance to traffic in such coins. As we saw in Children's Coiner, the coin commonly used for payment had an image of the emperor's head. And the coin's inscription would have said, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus on one side, and Pontifex Maximus, which Jesus would understand as high priest, on the other side. This combination of image and inscription would offend most Palestinian Jews. So then, without any seeming effort, they hand Jesus a denarius. Some commentators have seen in this a subtle reversal of the confrontation, in that Jesus is now pointing out to the surrounding crowd that the very people doing the asking are already trafficking in the supposedly offensive coins. So he takes it and he asks his questioners a question. Typical move by Jesus, and this time they have to give the answer. Whose likeness and inscription is this? Whose image is this? The question does have tremendous implications. Jesus is acknowledging that the coin contains an image, and the worship of images was explicitly forbidden in the Ten Commandments. But that's not the only time this word is used. In the Old Testament, the only thing made in the image of God that is not condemned as an idol is humanity. Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So the coin bears the image of Caesar, as the Pharisees acknowledge, but the audience bears the image of God. Verse 21, they said, Caesar's image on the coin. Then he said to them, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Now some see this as merely, what are you doing with Caesar's coin? It's his coin. Give it back to him. But we know there's more here. In ancient Israel, religion and state were one and the same. It was a theocratic nation. God was the ultimate ruler, even after they had a king. But the nations that conquered Israel, Rome in particular, were also nations where state and religion were deeply linked. Rome, in fact, was in the process of deifying the emperor, declaring him a god on earth who must be worshipped. Soon, Jesus' followers, the early Christians, would face the wrath of Rome because they refused to participate in emperor worship, a refusal that state judged to be atheism and treason. Jesus is, even here, giving guidance for that development and for all the other church-state conflicts that would follow. So what does he say? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but give to God what is God's. Yeah, Caesar's image is on the coin. Give him his coin. God's image is on you. Give him yourself. Actually, the word is give him his coin back. Give him yourself back. So we are to give money to Caesar, but we are to give ourselves to God. All of us as God's. Everything in life is God's first. John Piper says, when you realize that all of life, including all of Caesar's rights and powers and possessions, belong to God, then you will be in a proper frame of mind to render to Caesar what is Caesar's. In fact, once you recognize that all of life is God's, anything you render to Caesar, you will render for God's sake, for his honor. Peter says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him, for the Lord's sake. This is Peter's way of saying everything is God's, and this limits what is Caesar's and how you render it to him. Namely, render to Caesar nothing that you cannot render for the Lord's sake. Any authority you ascribe to Caesar, you ascribe to him for the sake of God's greater authority. Any obedience you render for the sake of the obedience you owe first to God. Any claim Caesar, any claim the nation makes on you, you test by the infinitely higher claim that God has on you. Everything is God's first and only becomes Caesar's by God's permission and design. What things can we give back then to Caesar? Paul helps us in Romans 13. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, God's first, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is an authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Taxes, revenue, respect, honor. These things may rightfully be given to governing authorities because they're set up by God and because in honoring them, we are recognizing God's divine design. Therefore, we not only pay our taxes, but we respect our president and elected officials. And yet there is a limit. Both Peter and Paul recognize that we must serve God rather than men. When the apostles were told to stop preaching the gospel of Jesus, they refused. When Paul was tortured and imprisoned by authorities, he kept sharing Jesus. When the early church was told to save their lives by saying Caesar is Lord, they said Jesus is Lord, even at the cost of the lions or the stake. I've often told the story of Polycarp, bishop of Smyrna, during a time of intense persecution in the 2nd century. Though he was old, he refused to leave the area, and so he was arrested. He was taken to a public arena where the proconsul, the Roman, tried to persuade him to recant his faith. But he refused. The proconsul threatened him and then said, "Swear by Caesar, and I will release you. Curse the Christ." Polycarp said, 86 years have I served him, and he hath done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? There is a line. There is a limit. We give respect and allegiance and taxes to Caesar unless to do so would violate a direct command of God and our consciences. Let's apply this to several contemporary issues. Taxes, I think we can cover quickly. We may feel our government is pagan, immoral, and wasteful. Well, so was Rome. And Peter, Paul, and Jesus all agree you pay the tax. Now, I can't imagine times you wouldn't. I can imagine not paying taxes in Nazi Germany as part of a larger protest against its treatment of the Jews and the Gypsies and others. I can imagine having such a strong pacifist conviction that I would symbolically withhold that portion of my taxes used for war making, but only as part of a specific intentional protest against that government policy. But the idea that I can refuse taxes just because the money isn't used exactly as I would use it or is excessive wouldn't hold much water with Paul or Peter in the government of Rome, especially since we live in a system where we are permitted to change things politically, and we should. But what about abortion and health care coverage? If the government says it's okay and funds it, must I comply? I don't think so. I agree with Hobby Lobby and other privately held companies who say it's a violation of religious conscience to be forced to implement a health care program that would provide abortion to their employees. The Supreme Court will hear arguments from Hobby Lobby March 25th, and the government is making its case through the media. White House advisor Valerie Jarrett, writing in the Huffington Post, says a woman's health care decisions should be in her own hands, not her boss's. In other words, according to the White House, a person's religious convictions cannot, in our country, extend to the company they own. Hobby Lobby, if they lose, is willing to shut down the company rather than violate these convictions. Take the issue of homosexual marriage. Where's the line? I think that if a pagan culture wants to act pagan, they're going to do so. But should Christians be required to condone any kind of sinful behavior? No. So if you're a cake baker and you can't in good conscience make a cake for a homosexual couple or a cake for a divorcing couple and thus participate in the celebration of their sin, I believe you're justified in refusing. You might have to bear the consequences, and I believe you do that peacefully. That's how Paul always handled his conflicts with the state. Gail and I have often had the recognition that I could easily end up in jail someday. Right at the moment, a pastor was not forced to perform a wedding that violates his conscience, but it could happen, and I would go to jail rather than do that. The culture may not know what marriage is, but the Bible does, and I have to serve God rather than man. Some of my brothers in the chaplaincies of our armed forces are going to be faced with this impasse sooner rather than later. But to give another personal example, a court in Michigan, I believe, that was Wisconsin, recently ruled that it was unconstitutional for a pastor to receive a tax break for a housing allowance. This is a historic tax break that grew out of the days when most pastors had their housing directly provided by their churches. And so when they didn't, the government said, the portion of their income used for housing should be exempt from income taxes. And if that tax break goes away, will I protest? No. I'll pay the government their taxes and continue to put God first, I hope. And of course, in many countries, it's the sharing of our faith itself that's persecuted by the government. Believers through the ages have chosen time after time to serve God rather than men and suffer the consequences. In China, in Iraq, in North Korea, and around the world today, our brothers and sisters are suffering because they speak about Jesus. To cite just one example, in Mogadishu, Somalia, a Muslim convert to Christianity was killed near the end of last year by gunmen who accused him of spreading the faith. 2 men armed with pistols shot Abdikhani Hassan 7 times outside his home. He's survived by his pregnant wife and 5 children, ranging in ages from 3 to 12. Before killing him, one of the assailants told a neighbor, "We have information that Hassan is spreading wrong religion to our people, and we are looking for him." And he knew they would find him, but he persevered. Most of us don't face that kind of persecution. In fact, most of us don't even think too hard about paying taxes. Right at the moment, you may be thinking about it, trying to get your tax data together and file, but for most, that's only a minor irritant. You may have a bigger problem with the things our government is doing. We may even recognize that someday conscience will force us into civil disobedience, but it's not, for most of us, a present imposition. And so, we tend to have an ignore it, follow the rules, and hope it will go away attitude toward our government and social institutions. What worries me is that many of us can be tempted into the same nonchalance toward God. We do the minimum we think necessary to identify ourselves as his people and reap the future rewards he promises, but we don't have a compelling conviction that all of life is God's. And because we're made in God's image and remade in the image of his Son, we must give to God all that bears his image, which is every bit, part, parcel, and thought of ourselves. We are called to give Caesar what is Caesar's, fine. But we are also called to give everything, time, money, devotion, service, family, work, leisure, everything to God. It's all his. One way or another, it all has his name on it. We are only stewards, we're not owners. I want to close with a prose poem I found recently, reflecting on this text that put this really well. You, made in God's image, stamped with God's likeness, you are God's valuable coin. God intends to spend you according to his desire, to spend you on life, on what delights him. Will you be a coin that is rolled under the sofa, or one stuck to the bottom of the piggy bank, saved but never spent, never redeemed, waiting for some future that never comes? No, beloved, be spent. Let God give you away and have a blast doing it. Let God hand you over for the very thing God longs for, as thankful for you as a beggar is grateful for the coin that buys him lunch. You're God's. So give yourself to God, knowing God will spend you. And trust this, that spent, sent into the world by the God of death and rising, the God who loses nothing, tomorrow you will find yourself anew in God's pocket. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, for the Lord's sake. But give to God what is his, your very self, for the Lord's sake, to be spent for his glory. Jesus' answer has far more in our lives to do with our relationship with God than it actually does with our relationship with the state. Because all of life, all of my life, all of your life is God.